You just walked through the door. You've been gone for 6 hours, and your baby, who was perfectly calm, playing, babbling, completely fine, one look at you, and completely falls apart. Screaming, arms reaching, face crumpling, inconsolable. And every parent in that moment thinks the same thing. Did I do something wrong? Is this separation anxiety? Is my baby mad at me? Some parents feel guilty. Some feel rejected. Some feel like they're failing somehow. Because shouldn't the baby be happy to see them? Here's what nobody tells you. That cry, that specific gut-wrenching cry you hear the moment your baby sees your face after missing you, is not a sign that something is wrong. It is one of the most sophisticated emotional responses that exists in the human brain. And the neuroscience behind it will completely change how you see your child. The obvious explanation is that your baby was holding it together while you were gone, and then let go the moment you came back, like a pressure valve releasing. And that's partially true, but it's also almost completely wrong, because it misses the deeper question. Why does your baby feel safe enough to fall apart only with you? Why not with the caregiver who was there all day? Why not when a stranger walks in? Why only when they see your face? The answer has almost nothing to do with separation, and everything to do with how your baby's brain is wired at a biological level. Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, published findings that reframe this entirely. What you're watching is not a breakdown. It is your baby performing a precise, targeted emotional signal, aimed specifically at the only person in the world their brain categorizes as a safe base. In other words, your baby isn't crying because you left. They're crying because you came back. And that distinction changes everything. To understand what's actually happening, you have to go back to 1969. A British psychiatrist named John Bowlby had spent decades studying children who were separated from their caregivers, orphans, evacuees, hospitalized children. And he noticed something that nobody had systematically studied before. Children don't just want their caregivers. They need them, in the same way they need food and water, not as a preference, as a survival mechanism. Bowlby called it attachment theory, and it describes something radical for its time, that human infants are born pre-wired at a neurological level to seek and maintain proximity to a specific caregiver. Not any caregiver, a primary one. And the system doesn't work the way most people assume. Most people think the attachment bond means a baby wants their caregiver nearby at all times. That's not quite right. What a securely attached baby actually has is something researchers call a safe base. A person whose presence gives them the psychological permission to explore, to be independent, to feel things, to fall apart. Think of it like a tether. A baby on a long tether can range far, but the moment they're scared, hurt, overwhelmed, they come back to the anchor. You are the anchor. And when you reappear after an absence, you are not just a familiar face. You are the activation signal for every backed up emotion your baby's nervous system has been managing, suppressing, or deferring while you were gone. Now here's where a psychologist named Mary Ainsworth takes this further. In the 1970s, Ainsworth designed an experiment called the strange situation procedure, now one of the most replicated studies in all of developmental psychology. She put infants between 12 and 18 months through a series of mild separations and reunions with their caregivers while watching their behavior. What she found was that babies responded in distinctly different ways upon reunion. Securely attached babies, those with sensitive, responsive caregivers, cried. They reached. They sought comfort. And then, after contact and soothing, they settled. This was not what Ainsworth expected to be the healthy pattern. She expected secure babies to be, well, calm. Instead, the most psychologically healthy babies were often the ones making the biggest fuss, because the crying wasn't a sign of distress. It was a sign of trust. It was a baby saying, "I know you will respond, so I am telling you everything I held back." But why does the body do this? Why does seeing a safe person trigger an emotional release rather than prevent one? The answer is in your baby's stress chemistry, specifically cortisol. When you leave, your baby's body activates what researchers call the stress response cascade. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, begins to rise. Their heart rate increases. Their nervous system shifts into a state of heightened vigilance. Here's the part most people don't know. Babies are extraordinarily good at suppressing the outward signs of this stress, even while the internal biological response is happening. Researchers at the University of Amsterdam measured cortisol levels in infants during daycare separations. The babies looked fine. They played, they ate, they responded to their caregivers. No visible distress. But their cortisol was elevated, significantly. Their bodies were working hard, using enormous regulatory effort just to appear okay. And then you walk in. Your face, your smell, your voice. These are processed in your baby's brain as safety cues that directly downregulate the stress response. Oxytocin rises. Cortisol begins to fall. The threat assessment part of the brain, the amygdala, gets a signal. You can stand down now. And the moment that suppression lifts, the moment the nervous system stops working so hard to contain everything, the backed up emotional load comes out, all at once. This is called reunion stress discharge. And it's not unique to infants. You've experienced it yourself. Think of the last time you were in a genuinely stressful situation. Not dangerous, just prolonged and draining. A long work presentation, a difficult medical appointment, a hard conversation. You held it together. You were professional. You were composed. And then you got home. You saw someone you trusted, and something cracked open. That was the same mechanism, the same neurobiological process, just happening in an adult brain with more regulatory bandwidth. In a 12-month-old, that bandwidth is almost non-existent. The release is total and immediate. This is why your baby doesn't cry like this with the daycare teacher, or the grandparent, or the babysitter. Those people may be warm, caring, and familiar, but they are not the attachment figure. Only you have the neurochemical key, and here's where it gets extraordinary. In 2015, a team at Azabu University in Japan published findings in Science, one of the most rigorous journals in the world, showing that when a dog and its owner gaze at each other, both experience simultaneous rises in oxytocin. The reason I'm telling you about dogs is because the same research team later replicated a parallel effect in human parent-infant pairs. And what they found reveals something fundamental about how attachment works chemically. When a caregiver responds to a baby's reunion cry, picks them up, makes eye contact, soothes them, both the caregivers and the baby's oxytocin levels rise in synchrony. The baby cries, the parent responds. Oxytocin floods both nervous systems. The baby feels safer. The parent feels more bonded. The baby calms. It is a self-completing loop. The cry initiates it. Your response completes it. And every single time this loop completes successfully, every time you come back and your baby cries and you respond and they calm, you are literally building the neural architecture of secure attachment in your child's brain. Not by preventing the cry, by being there for it. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think this reframe is the most important part of this video. Every parenting culture in the world gives parents an implicit message. A crying baby is a failing baby, or a failing parent. Crying is the problem. Calm is the goal. But developmental neuroscience says something completely different. A baby who cries freely in your presence, who falls apart when you return, is demonstrating that their attachment system is functioning exactly as it should. They are showing you that they know you are safe, that your presence is qualitatively different from everyone else's, that they have been holding something, waiting for you, and that the wait is over. Researchers at the University of Minnesota's longitudinal study, which followed children from infancy to adulthood, found that securely attached babies who showed strong reunion responses were more likely as adults to have stable relationships, healthier emotional regulation, and greater resilience under stress. The cry at the door is not the beginning of a problem. It is the evidence of an invisible strength being built. But I need to tell you something that changes this conversation. Not all reunion crying is the same. Because here's what happens to the attachment system when a baby's bids for comfort are consistently not met. When the emotional discharge is repeatedly interrupted, ignored, or punished. Developmental researchers call this insecure attachment, and it has two distinct patterns that look completely opposite on the surface. The first is anxious attachment. These babies cry more, cling harder, and cannot be soothed. They don't trust that you'll return, so they escalate. Every goodbye becomes a crisis. Every reunion becomes a desperate grab for reassurance that never quite satisfies. The second is more alarming because it looks like the opposite problem. Avoidant attachment. These babies seem calm at reunion. They don't cry. They don't reach for you. They appear indifferent. But here's what the research shows. Their cortisol levels are just as elevated as the anxious babies. They learned that expressing need doesn't work, so they stopped expressing it. They are in distress, silent, internal, invisible distress, and they've learned to hide it from the one person who was supposed to be safe. The baby who doesn't cry at the door isn't easier. They're telling you something you need to hear. This is why researchers consistently emphasize that the goal is not to eliminate the reunion cry. It is to be reliably available for it. Sensitivity, consistency, response, not perfection. You do not need to be there every moment, or never make mistakes, or never be tired. Research by developmental psychologist Ed Tronick showed that even in healthy attachments, caregivers are only in sync with their babies about 30% of the time. The other 70% involves misattunement and repair. It is the repair that builds the bond, not the absence of rupture. So the next time you walk through that door, exhausted from a long day, already apologizing in your head for being gone, and your baby sees your face and completely falls apart, what you're watching is not a baby who struggled without you. It is a baby who survived without you, who held it together, managed the arousal, regulated just enough, and then saw your face and knew they didn't have to anymore. They're not angry that you left. They're relieved that you're back. And the cry is not a burden for you to fix. It is an invitation, the most fundamental invitation the human brain can issue, to be close, to respond, to complete the loop. The neuroscience is clear. Your presence, your response, your consistency in these small, ordinary moments. You reaching for your baby when they cry at the door. This is how attachment is built. Synapse by synapse. Reunion by reunion. And the research suggests that this invisible work you do, right there in the hallway, shoes still on, is one of the most important things you will ever do for your child. If this reframed how you see your baby, subscribe, because every video in this series goes this deep. And drop a comment below. Does your baby do this? Do they hold it together all day and then fall apart the moment they see you?